USS North Carolina, DB-55, is the lead ship of the North Carolina class of fast battleships, the first vessel of the type built for the United States Navy. Built under the Washington Treaty System, North Carolina's design was limited in displacement and armament, though the United States used a clause in the Second London Naval Treaty to increase the main battery from the original armament of 12 14-inch, 356 mm, guns to 9 16-in, 406 mm, guns. The ship was laid down in 1937 and completed in April 1941, while the United States was still neutral during World War II. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December, North Carolina mobilized for war and was initially sent to counter a possible sortie by the German battleship Tirpitz, though this did not materialize and North Carolina was promptly transferred to the Pacific to strengthen Allied forces during the Guadalcanal Campaign. There, she screened aircraft carriers engaged in the campaign and took part in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on 24 August 25, 1942, where she shot down several Japanese aircraft. The next month, she was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine but was not seriously damaged. After repairs, she returned to the campaign and continued to screen carriers during the campaigns across the Central Pacific in 1943 and 1944, including the Gilberts and Marshall Islands and the Mariana and Palau Islands, where she saw action during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The ship was undergoing a refit during the invasion of the Philippines but took part in the later stages of the Philippines campaign and was present when the fleet was damaged by Typhoon Cobra. She took part in offensive operations in support of the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945, including numerous attacks on Japan. Following the surrender of Japan in August, she carried American personnel home during Operation Magic Carpet. North Carolina operated briefly off the east coast of the United States in 1946 before being decommissioned the next year and placed in reserve. Stricken from the Naval Vessel Register in 1960, the ship was saved from the breaker's yard by a campaign to preserve the vessel as a museum ship in her namesake state. In 1962, the North Carolina Museum was opened in Wilmington, North Carolina. Service history. The keel for North Carolina was laid down at the New York Naval Shipyard on October 27, 1937. Her completed hull was launched on June 13, 1940, and the ship was commissioned into the fleet on April 9, 1941 in a ceremony attended by Governor of North Carolina J. Melville Broughton. The ship's first commanding officer was Captain Olaf M. Husvet. North Carolina embarked on her shakedown cruise in the Caribbean Sea and spent the rest of the year working up while the United States remained neutral during World War II. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December, North Carolina began extensive battle training to prepare for combat in the Pacific War. Her first operation came in April 1942, when she was deployed to Naval Station Argentia on 23 April as part of a force intended to block a potential sortie by the German battleship Tirpitz if she attempted to break out into the convoy lanes of the North Atlantic. Tirpitz remained in Norway, however, and North Carolina was quickly replaced by the battleship South Dakota, allowing North Carolina to get underway for the Pacific in mid-1942. She passed through the Panama Canal on 10 June in company with the aircraft carriers Wasp and Long Island and 9 destroyers. On 15 June, North Carolina was assigned to Task Force, TF-18, centered on Wasp, along with 4 cruisers and 9 destroyers, under the command of Rear Admiral Lee Noyes. Guadalcanal Campaign. North Carolina was sent to join the Guadalcanal Campaign as part of TF-16, which also included the aircraft carrier Enterprise, the heavy cruiser Portland, the light cruiser Atlanta, and 6 destroyers. The unit was part of TF-61, commanded by Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher, and sent to cover the landing of the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal to seize the airfield being constructed there by the Japanese. TF-61 also included the carriers Saratoga and Wasp. North Carolina covered Enterprise on the first day of the invasion of Guadalcanal and Tulagi on 7 August, and thereafter remained in company with Enterprise to protect the carrier from Japanese air attacks. Fear of Japanese land-based torpedo bombers prompted Fletcher to withdraw the carrier groups the next day. The initial landing met little resistance, but a Japanese cruiser squadron attacked the invasion fleet on the night of 9 August, inflicting a major defeat on Allied naval forces in the Battle of Savo Island. The Navy briefly considered forming a surface combat force to counter the Japanese cruisers that would have been centered on North Carolina, with 5 heavy and 1 light cruiser and 4 destroyers, but it was determined that the need to protect the carrier task forces was too great to strip away their heavy units. In this role, she participated in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on 24–25 August. American forces had detected a group of Japanese carriers on the 24th and immediately launched attacks from Saratoga that sank the light carrier Ryujo. A Japanese counterattack struck the American fleet, and North Carolina was the first to detect it, shortly after 1600 hours, using her air search radar. The Japanese initially concentrated on Enterprise, and North Carolina contributed her anti-aircraft fire to her defense. Enterprise increased speed to 30 knots, 56 kilometers per hour, 35 miles per hour, causing North Carolina to drop back, ultimately falling to around 4,000 yards, 3,700 meters, astern. A group of 7 HEDEA dive bombers attacked North Carolina at 1643, but they all missed. North Carolina emerged from the battle unscathed, though one man was killed by a strafing aircraft. Enterprise was hit by 3 bombs, but aircraft from Saratoga severely damaged the seaplane tender Chitose in return. North Carolina's anti-aircraft claimed to have shot down between 7 and 14 aircraft, though evaluation of the gunner's effectiveness is mixed. The historian Richard B. Frank noted that the Japanese lost a total of 18 DEAs and credited Enterprise's Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters with half of them, with the rest shot down by the ships, with the lion's share to gunners aboard Enterprise. The naval analyst Norman Friedman highlighted the effectiveness of the 5-inch guns aboard Enterprise and North Carolina, but noted that the ship had difficulty tracking targets with her fire control radar, owing to a combination of rapid maneuvering to avoid attacks, excessive vibration from steaming at high speed, and the number of friendly and hostile aircraft aloft. Contemporary observers took an optimistic view of the ship's performance. Her captain credited her with shooting down 5 to 7 aircraft. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander, U.S. Pacific Fleet, noted that her 5-inch fire was particularly effective in dissuading Japanese attacks. While Enterprise withdrew for repairs, North Carolina was transferred to TF-17 to cover Saratoga, along with Atlanta, and a pair of destroyers that the ships operated off Guadalcanal for the next several weeks, during which time Japanese submarines attempted to torpedo North Carolina twice. The first, on 6 September, passed some 300 yards, 270 meters, off her port side, but the second, from the submarine I-19 on 15 September, damaged the ship. I-19 had fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at Wasp and TF-18, 2 or 3 of which hit. 2 of the Type 95 torpedoes continued onto the ships of TF-17, some 5 nautical miles, 9.3 kilometers, 5.8 miles, away. 1 hit the destroyer O'Brien, and a 4th hit North Carolina. The hit on North Carolina struck the ship 20 feet, 6.1 meters, below the waterline on her port side and tore a 32 by 18 foot, 9.8 by 5.5 meters, hole in the plating. 5 men were killed in the attack, but the torpedo inflicted little serious damage, apart from the shock of the blast that disabled the forward turret. Flooding occurred and North Carolina took on a list of 5.5 degrees to port, but this was quickly corrected with counter-flooding and she was able to remain on station with Saratoga, cruising at a speed of 25 knots, 46 kilometers per hour, 29 miles per hour. The other 2 ships were not so lucky, with Wasp being scuttled that evening and O'Brien eventually foundering a month later when her hull finally buckled from the damage. 2021-22, after withdrawing from the area, North Carolina was detached to Pearl Harbor to make repairs, which lasted from 30 September to 17 November. After returning to the South Pacific, North Carolina resumed screening Saratoga and Enterprise, which had also completed repairs by this time. The American fleet had been strengthened by North Carolina's sister ship Washington, which served as the flagship of Rear Admiral Willis Lee. The 2 battleships were grouped together as TF-64 under Lee's command. The ships covered convoys carrying soldiers and supplies to the Solomon Islands for the rest of 1942 and into 1943 as the Guadalcanal Campaign ground on. These operations included covering a group of 7 transports carrying elements of the 25th Infantry Division to Guadalcanal from 1 to January 4, 1943. During another of these convoy operations later that month, the battleships, which by this time had been reinforced by the battleship Indiana, were too far south to be able to reach the American cruiser force during the Battle of Rennell Island at the end of the month. North Carolina returned to Pearl Harbor in March for a refit that lasted for more than a month and included the installation of radars and improved fire control equipment. On returning to the South Pacific, she joined the battleship group of TF-36, now commanded by Rear Admiral Glenn B. Davis and consisting of Indiana and Massachusetts. The battleship and carrier groups covered amphibious assault forces during Operation Cartwheel, the campaign to isolate the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul, in late June and early July. They did not see action during the campaign, as fighting was limited to both sides' light forces. In September, she made another trip to Pearl Harbor to make preparations for the attack on the Gilbert Islands. Gilbert and Marshall Islands Campaign. North Carolina underway during the Gilberts Campaign. For the assault on the Gilberts, the fleet was organized into TF-50, which was divided into several task groups, TG. The ship sortied on 10 November, once again in company with Enterprise as part of TG 50.2 to support the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign, which began with assaults on Macon, Tarawa, and Abamama. The group also included Massachusetts and Indiana and a pair of light carriers and 6 destroyers. North Carolina covered the carriers while they raided the islands beginning on 19 November. On 8 December, North Carolina was detached to form TG 50.8 with the other battleships of the fleet, Massachusetts, Indiana, South Dakota, and Washington, again under Lee's command. The ships bombarded the island of Nauru while the fleet prepared for the next operation in the campaign in the Marshalls. North Carolina then escorted the carrier Bunker Hill during a series of strikes on Caving on the island of New Ireland in late December. On January 6, 1944, TF-58, the Fast Carrier Task Force, was created under the command of Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher. North Carolina continued in her role as an escort for the fleet's carriers with the unit as part of TG 58.2. During the Battle of Kwajalein, North Carolina initially remained with the carriers during the pre-invasion bombardment, but was then detached to close with the island and join the bombardment group targeting ROI Namur, which also included Washington, Indiana, and Massachusetts. During the attack, she sank a cargo ship in the harbor. After the islands were conquered in 4 days of heavy fighting, TF-58 departed to raid Truk, which had been Japan's primary staging area in the Central Pacific. By this time, North Carolina had been transferred to TG 58.3. The attack, codenamed Operation Hailstone, inflicted serious damage, sinking or destroying 39 ships, destroying 211 aircraft and damaging another 104 planes. With the Marshalls and Gilbert secured, the Fast Carrier Task Force embarked on a series of raids in the Central Pacific to prepare for the upcoming attack on the Mariana Islands. The fleet sortied from Majuro, its new base in the Marshalls, in late March to begin the first attack on Palau and WWII, conducted from 31 March to 1 April. During these operations, North Carolina shot down a Japanese aircraft. The fleet then sailed south to support the U.S. Army's landing at Hollandia during the New Guinea campaign from 13 to 24 April. Another attack on Truk followed on 29 to 30 April. North Carolina shot down another Japanese aircraft during the attack. 2 of her Kingfisher floatplanes were sent to rescue a downed pilot who had crashed off the reef. One of them capsized on landing and the second was unable to take off with the additional weight from the first plane's crew and the pilot they had gone to pick up, so the submarine Tang picked up the men instead. On 1 May, North Carolina and 6 other battleships organized as TG 58.7 bombarded Pohnpei, destroying Japanese artillery batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and damaging the airfield on the island. TF-58 then returned to its bases in Majuro and Eniwetok on 4 May. From there, North Carolina departed to Pearl Harbor for repairs to her rudder. Mariana and Palau Islands Campaign. After completing repairs, North Carolina rejoined the fleet at Majuro while it was preparing for the attack on the Marianas. On arriving, she returned to TG 58.7, which was distributed between the 4 carrier task groups. She and the rest of TF-58 sortied on 6 June to launch the first assault in the campaign, targeting the island of Saipan. In addition to screening the carriers, North Carolina also bombarded the island to cover the minesweepers as they cleared paths to the invasion beach. She shelled Tanapog Harbor, sank several small vessels, and destroyed several supply dumps. On 15 June, the Marines went ashore and a Japanese counterattack struck the fleet, though all but 2 of the aircraft were shot down by the carrier's combat air patrol. Of those 2, North Carolina shot 1 down. The landing was a breach of Japan's inner defensive perimeter that triggered the Japanese fleet to launch a major counter-thrust with the 1st Mobile Fleet, the main carrier strike force. As the Japanese fleet approached, North Carolina and the rest of TF-58 steamed to meet it on 18 June, leading to the Battle of the Philippine Sea on 19–20 June. North Carolina and the other battleships, with 4 cruisers and 13 destroyers, were deployed some 15 nautical miles, 28 kilometers, 17 miles, west of the carrier groups to screen the likely path of approach. The Japanese launched their aircraft first, and as they probed the American fleet's defenses, North Carolina and Washington were the first battleships to open fire on the attacking Japanese aircraft. During the action, which was fought primarily by the carriers, the U.S. fleet inflicted serious losses on the Japanese, destroying hundreds of their aircraft and sinking 3 carriers. In the course of the battle, North Carolina shot down 2 Japanese aircraft. North Carolina remained on station off the Marianas for the next 2 weeks before being detached for an overhaul at the Puget Sound Navy Yard.